All right. Well, maybe we'll go ahead and get started. I know that other folks may end up trickling in. My name is Dr. Leah Hecht. I am an EPPP coach and tutor, part of the Psychologists of Color EPPP offering. And I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker for this evening, Dr. Erica Ligons. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Dr. Ligons is a licensed clinical psychologist with more than 7 years of experience who owns and operates her own solo private practice. She has experience treating adults, children, adolescents, and families from diverse backgrounds. Dr. Ligons speaks Spanish fluently and is able to provide therapy services in Spanish for those who prefer a bilingual therapist. Dr. Ligons specializes in working with adults and children with complex trauma, anxiety, depression, attention deficit disorder, school and behavioral concerns, relationship challenges, and life transitions. Dr. Ligons is also trained in prolonged exposure therapy for PTSD, psychodrama, and psychometry and evidence-based parenting strategies. She is also passionate about helping future psychologists to launch their careers successfully. She enjoys supervising new psychologists and has built a successful EPPP coaching business. So welcome, Dr. Ligons. Ligons, right? Ligons.
Yeah.
Ligons. Okay, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Dr. Ligons, thank you so much for joining us. I will turn this over to you. Very excited for your presentation this evening. And I believe we'll have some time at the end for questions.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'm going to take a moment here to switch over and share my screen so that you all can see what I see. Okay. Now I just need to move your heads a little bit. Okay, here we go. All right, so I am really excited to be here. Whenever I get the opportunity to talk to people about the EPPP, I'm always really excited because several years ago when I was going through this process, I don't think there were any Facebook groups or anything like that, or if there were, I just didn't know about them. And so I was completely alone. All of the support that I had for the EPPP came through a handful of conversations with the previous postdocs from the year prior, literally in between sessions. So like 1 to 2 minutes of talking to just point me in the right direction. And obviously that's really not enough sufficient support to really help someone to overcome this final, chapter that we need to get through. And so I'm really excited to be here. And so first, I'd like to share a little bit about my story. Thankfully, I was able to pass the EPPP on the first try with a score of 659. For those who are new to this process, for doctoral level candidates, you need a 500. And I did this despite having test anxiety and ADHD. I had a lot of anxiety with standardized tests because I'd never done well on any of them. In fact, I strategically only applied to graduate schools that didn't require the GRE because my GRE scores were so low. And again, a lot of that's due to ADHD that I had growing up and just not a lot of confidence with taking tests. So although I did pass on the first try, my road to EPPP success was filled with all sorts of challenges. It took multiple times for me to be able to study to finally be able to sit down and follow a program that I created, which I now teach to people, and it's a part of my master plan system. But it was filled with tons of anxiety at first. I used to become physically ill every time I sat down to study. It was really a mess at first, and I felt so alone and overwhelmed. And so that's one of my goals, is to really help people to not feel so overwhelmed and to really have a system and a strategy up front. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking specifically about the barriers that people of color in particular face during this journey and talk through how to overcome them. If you are new to this process and you kind of need more nuts and bolts information about what the EPPP is, how it works, how long it takes to prepare, all that good stuff, I actually did a previous presentation back in March. So you can look on the Psychologists of Color website and find that recording and get that basic information that you need. So before we go deeper, I do just want to touch on the preparation part just so that we can have that framework. So I always say preparing for the EPPP is similar to preparing for a marathon. It takes about 15 to 20 hours per week over the course of 3 to 4 months, but hopefully no more than 6 months. This is going to roughly get you around that 300-hour mark, which is the amount of time that most experts recommend that you put into studying. So this thing is a doozy, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, and it's a lot of time. And it's not easy given that we've already put in so much time and effort and don't have a whole lot left in the tank. So essentially, when you're studying for this exam, it feels like you're studying for 11 classes at the same time because there's 11 different domains that the test prep companies break the content down into. And although a lot of it at the doctoral level you have been exposed to before, some of it you haven't. And the things that you have seen before, you probably saw at the beginning of your graduate degree or even in undergrad. So it is quite the undertaking to do this. Totally possible, but it is a challenge. So let's talk about the failure rates amongst groups of color or groups in different groups. And the numbers I'm going to give you are based on first time failure rates. So on average, if a person identifies as white or Caucasian, they have about a 14% chance of failing the first time. But as you can see, these numbers drastically go up when we talk about communities of color. This is very disheartening to see these disparities. It's very sad, it's very frustrating, and the impact of this is really great. And let me tell you, the heaviness of this impact on people, not only is it financial, but also emotionally, mentally, the way it impacts family life and relationships because of the amount of time and energy that goes into this, and also occupationally, holding you back from being able to be fully licensed to do the work that you want to do out here in the world. I feel so blessed every day that I get to wake up and work from home and do what I want to do. I was working for a private practice previously, which I loved. I loved the person I was working for. A long history. They trained me. It was a wonderful place to be. But I really found that I liked working from home and I wanted to do more EPPP coaching and private practice coaching and all these other things. And so I made the decision that I wanted to leave, and I was able to obviously do that because I was fully licensed. And so the limitations that people have when they're not fully licensed really impacts their life. And what these statistics don't show is all of that pain and suffering that's happening to clinicians of color in particular, because basically when I've looked into things, I'm only seeing stats on the first time attempt. They're not looking into how many more times it takes on average for people to pass this exam. And again, the overall impact of that emotionally, financially, occupationally, et cetera. So let's talk about, why is this happening to people of color? Why are we seeing these horrible statistics, manifesting? So right now, based on what I've heard over 4 years of coaching, is basically people are walking around with the belief that people of color are failing this exam because it's bias. Now, we have to ask ourselves, does this fully explain, though, what's happening? And I don't think it does. I think it's much more complex than this. Now, before the internet comes for me and everybody revolts against that, I am in no way saying that the EPPP and the process around it doesn't have bias. It most certainly does. And it's for a few different reasons. Number one, our field is not diverse enough. I don't know about some of the other ethnic groups, but I know for clinicians that identify as Black or African American, only 4% of us are psychologists. And so, or I'm sorry, of all of the psychologists, only 4% identify as Black or African American. That is not even half of what the population of Black Americans is within this country. I mean, you would hope that at least the field would be representative of the proportion to the population at minimum. And that's just not happening. And that's very sad. And obviously, it's the same for other minority groups as well. So when you don't have enough representation of minority groups in a field, and they're not the ones who are creating the tests and creating all of the bureaucracy around it, inherently there's going to be bias. You have to have Black and brown people in the room where it happens. And if we're not, inherently there's going to be bias. Also, for anyone who's taken the exam before, you know the questions are written in very weird ways. It's excessively convoluted and doesn't take into consideration how ethnic minorities use language. Also, sometimes the questions use terminology that's unfamiliar, particularly when we're taking into account, again, race and class. I'll give you a perfect example. Now, this was a practice test, but nonetheless, it still is worth talking about. One of my coaching clients brought to my attention one time that they found a question on a practice exam where it was asking about MAOIs and the foods that one should avoid when they're taking that kind of medication in order to prevent side effects. And we know with MAOIs, you need to avoid things like aged cheese and I think certain types of meats, like dried meats or something like that, as well as wine, particularly I think red wine. But in the question, it had the brand name or the type of wine instead of just saying wine. So like let's say it was Merlot, for example. I know where I come from. Nobody knows what Merlot is. And so that's just one example of how questions can be written in a certain way that don't take into account people of different backgrounds who may not be exposed to different things and may not know what that word even is, right? And so just those subtle things are just examples of the bias that's just baked into this whole process. And we can't forget about other things, like, for example, for non-native speakers of English, they don't get any type of extra time on the exam. None of the language barriers not taken into consideration. And I think that's really unfair to people who don't speak English as their first language to be doing a task in their non-native language and not get that extra support. I certainly remember what it was like taking psychology classes while living in South America, and I didn't know what was going on half the time because of how fast things were moving, and it can be really hard on someone's confidence. So there's also other things such as just the overall process of applying, being able to afford to take the exam. It's extremely expensive. Most schools and training sites are not offering financial support, which again, when we look at clinicians of color who largely are first generation to go to college, maybe first generation American, they don't have the type of generational wealth where they can just call on family members and get large sums of money to help cover some of these costs. And because training positions don't pay very much, it really puts people in a difficult position. And I'm finding, although it's challenging for a lot of people, it's just disproportionately even more challenging for our BIPOC population of clinicians. So it goes without saying that there is inherent bias in this process that we cannot ignore and we should not minimize. However, there are other factors. So let's talk about something that's the bias that's related to this process. And that is the impact of white supremacy. I mean, living in a world that is built on white supremacy means that for a lot of Black and brown people, they're always feeling othered. I know for me, I was one of the only doctoral candidates in my program that identified as Black. I mean, you could count us on one hand. And it was like that all throughout school, all throughout college. And obviously, just sitting in a room and feeling constantly in minority status, you already feel very othered and very different. And then when you start dealing with things like overt or covert racism, those microaggressions, I certainly heard things, not so much my graduate program, but definitely in undergrad. Oh, they only admitted you to this program because they need to increase their diversity, or, oh, you just got in because they, feel bad for people of color or something like that. And those kind of things, of course, we internalize, and it gets into our self-esteem and really impacts our sense of confidence. And so by the time we get to the workplace, we are dealing with a lot of imposter syndrome. This is something that I'm seeing with a lot of my coaching clients, where they are working themselves almost to death every day, doing above and beyond, taking so many clients. And part of it is because they're trying to prove themselves, trying to show that they can keep up, that they're worthy of being there, even if this is on an unconscious level, it's still happening. And so how does this affect the EPPP? Right? Of course, it keeps us from having the energy as well as the time to study. There have been many times where I've actually asked coaching clients to please show me your work calendar. And I've seen 60, 70-hour work weeks, no separation between home and work life. If I can ask a favor, I think I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. If everyone could mute themselves if they're not already muted. Anyway, so I've asked people a lot of times, to really work on managing their work-life balance, because it's really impacting their ability to really dedicate themselves to studying and put in the time that's needed. Also, because of all these factors and the consensus that's kind of floating around amongst people of color that, well, this whole thing is just biased and there's no way I can overcome it, that creates a strong sense of self-defeat, anger, overwhelm, hopelessness, helplessness against standardized tests, right? Because we see standardized tests as an extension of white supremacy and systemic oppression, right? And so when people go to start studying, they're really overcome a lot of times with these really heavy emotions, which leads them to have a really hard time with fully engaging in the process. And it can really lead to self-fulfilling prophecy. So, like, let's say, for example, someone just really feels beaten down by this process and feels like they can't do it because they're Black or brown, and or an immigrant, or what have you. And every time they sit down to study, they feel so overcome with self-defeat, they just don't hardly study. They go in and out of avoidance. Or maybe they try to excessively study because they feel so overwhelmed by it. And then they study to a point where they have no balance in life. They're not sleeping, they're not taking care of themselves. And then they're going into the test completely exhausted and just really not absorbing the content because they're so overextended. So you can see how all of these different factors can come together to really make a person feel stuck and overwhelmed in this process. And then it just further perpetuates the idea that this test is biased and I can't do it. I have had coaching clients come to me who almost passed the exam on their own before ever even coming to me or any other coach. But yet, despite how close they got to passing, they still feel that they can't pass because the test is biased. And they have lost all hope and confidence in themselves, which really is upsetting to see that. So let's look at some of the other factors that are impacting people, particularly people of color, from passing, that are not necessarily related to the inherent bias within the exam. And that is, for a lot of BIPOC test takers, they're often their family's beacon of hope, and they carry a lot of pressure to succeed. So again, I'm really systemically oriented in my clinical work, and so I really bring that into my coaching work as well. And I get to know my coaching clients a bit, and I ask about who are your supports, who's in your realm, who's there for you. And what I find a lot of the time is they are the family's caretaker. Like the role of being the helper isn't just at work, it's also in their family and in their social circles. So they're carrying a lot of emotional as well as financial weight for their family, sometimes sending back money back home or just being that emergency backup financial support for people, or in a lot of cases, doing a lot of emotional support. One might even say people are giving away a lot of free therapy to family members and friends. And so not only are they exhausted from work because they're trying to overcome imposter syndrome and white supremacy, internalized white supremacy and oppression, but now they're also exhausted from just caretaking for everyone in their life. So again, this really impacts people's color's ability to focus and have the time to study. Also, just like anyone else, BIPOC people can fall into having ineffective study strategies. So in my coaching program, I teach you about, I think my list is about 12 or 15 of the top reasons why people fail, the mistakes they make while they're studying. And I'm not going to go over all of them because I wouldn't have the time, but I'm going to mention a couple of them that I talk about, which again is lack of preparation, whether that's just avoidance due to fear and anxiety about the process, or again, just a byproduct of just being so burnt out. Lack of study hours or inconsistency is a major factor. Also, but again, on the flip side, some people are going the opposite way where they're studying 30, 40 hours a week on top of their 40-hour a week job. And they're not studying effectively, as I mentioned before. And many are just taking the test before they're ready. I never thought when I became a coach that half the time I would be trying to talk people out of taking the test. But actually, that is the case. So often when people come to me, again, due to lack of support and just not having realistic expectations, they're often wanting to take the test a lot sooner than they're ready for because they're just so over it and they want it to be done. And so they're just kind of going in there on a hope and a prayer and praying that it all works out, which unfortunately, in so many cases, it just doesn't. And one of the other top things that I see is people relying very heavily on passive study methods alone. So they're really just reading content and listening to audios. And after doing that so many times, they get to have a general familiarity with the content, which they often then mistake with mastery. They assume that because they're reading it and it feels familiar as they're reading it, they think they know it. But the problem is when they step away and really have to define the concepts and use them and apply them, the content knowledge just really isn't there in the way that they think. And so one of my hardest jobs as a coach is to give the realities for coaching clients that oftentimes they need to study longer or more than they ever have, which is really difficult again when you already feel so beaten down by this process and are struggling to have a sense of hope when you feel that the whole thing is biased against you. So I know this may sound kind of depressing, like, oh my gosh, well, if this problem is this big, right? We've got the inherent bias in the test, plus all of these social cultural challenges, plus just regular study mistakes and people not knowing how to study. How do people of color pass this thing? And they do it in a few different ways. First of all, what we have to do is to remember that people can pass this exam, but they have to set appropriate boundaries with life and with work. They also need to get their support system involved. They need to have an effective study plan, which of course I help my coaching clients do all of these things. Also, they need to go to therapy. I'm going to be honest, I'm going to get on my soapbox for a moment. I am very concerned about the amount of clinicians I come across who have never done any of their own personal therapy. As a person of color in this world, just walking around every day, dealing with the constant stressors that one has to deal with, I think everybody just needs a therapy as a baseline. And if we're going to go to work every day and tell other people to let go of their stigma and bias about being in therapy, then all honesty, we have to do the same. And so I strongly encourage all of my coaching clients to be in personal therapy. So the last thing they really have to do is to work on their mindset. We have to focus on what one can control and let go of the bias and everything that's inherently baked into it. Because even though the bias is there and it does make things more challenging, people can pass this test. And I feel so strongly and fervently about this because remember, I've been coaching for a number of years now. I've had people of color come to me. In fact, I would say 98% of my clientele are people of color. And not only are they struggling with the internalized bias of the exam, but also they're dealing sometimes with other things like ADHD, anxiety, learning disabilities. Maybe they've, are single parent and they've got a lot of stress on them, or maybe they're older and they're scared that they can't learn anymore. I mean, or they're a non-native English speaker. I have seen it all, and I have at least a few people from every one of those categories that has successfully passed this exam, even with those barriers, along with being a person of color in the way. And they have worked through all of those things. So that's why I feel so strongly that yes, the test is biased, but we can still pass it. And that's what I hope everyone takes away from watching this today. If you feel beaten down and broken down by the bias in this process, although it will be challenging and you will have to put in more work than some of your non-POC counterparts to pass, you still can. Okay, so before we get to questions, I want to share a little bit more information about the 3 types of coaching scenarios that I often see land on my plate. So whenever people come to coaching, they're coming with varying levels of need and stress around this process. And we all have to remember that the Yerkes-Dodson law, that the more pressure, the lower the performance, is real. And I see this happening before my eyes all the time. So the first category of people that I work with have the highest level of stress and pressure. And that's those who I would consider are in crisis. The second group are those who I call this group the ones who are in a complicated situation. And the last group are those who are in what I would say would be an ideal situation. Okay, so let me break this down a little bit. So for those who are in a state of crisis where there's a high level of stress and pressure to pass the exam, typically what they have in common are some of the following things. Number one, there is a deadline to keep a job or continue to practice with a temporary license. And that deadline is looming, usually less than 120 days, sometimes even less than that. Sometimes people have 30 days, 60 days before they're not going to be able to work. And that is a huge level of pressure. I mean, we all know Maslow's hierarchy of needs is real. When the base of your pyramid is not satisfied, it is very difficult to be able to do anything else. So they're under an incredible amount of stress and pressure, especially if they're single or they're the primary breadwinner of their home and they have other dependents that rely on them, like children, elderly parents, what have you. Usually they have already failed the exam a few times. And again, this makes me really sad because I see so many people who have, again, just feel very run down by this process. They feel exhausted emotionally, mentally, financially. And we really have to do something to change this. We have to start getting to people when they first come out of school. Because again, just like so many, I got no information about what this whole thing entailed. And that's really doing a disservice to people that they're not being able to find the help that they need until they're already knee deep in it. And it's just unfair. So a lot of times, again, because of the failed attempts, the looming deadline, the stress, the pressure, whatever negative beliefs they already had about the test and its bias or this or that or the other, now that's heightened even more. And again, I'm seeing people who are very capable of passing this exam who have lost all sense of inner confidence and feel totally deflated because of the stress and the situation they're in. Also, this group, a lot of the time, part of what has led them to be in a crisis situation where the clock is counting down is because they were so burnt out and had such high levels of personal stress or poor work-life balance that that's, again, a lot of the reason why they kept failing the exam and therefore making the clock run out to when they have to pass because of those issues. Furthermore, they may have some other underlying things going on. Maybe they're dealing with some challenges with self-esteem, whether those were pre-existing or maybe now have come up as a result of struggling to pass this exam. So many of us have built our sense of identity, right, around being high achievers. And so it can be a really huge blow when suddenly we find ourselves struggling to pass this exam, and it can really throw people for a loop and make them feel really bad about themselves. And in some cases, people have other things going on like anxiety, but maybe again, maybe they're dealing with some internalized stigma. Maybe they've never done proper therapy work, or if they need medication, they're not taking it or haven't opened themselves up to considering it. Again, it could be some internalized stigma, ableism going on. And so they're dealing with that challenge on top of everything else. Not to mention, like I said, sometimes they're not in their own personal therapy, which can be a struggle. And because of all this pressure and stress, a lot of times their expectations are a bit unrealistic. They're hoping to be able to acquire the content knowledge they need and to be ready for the exam in a time frame that does not suit where their current level of readiness is. So, for example, I often will see things like someone's coming to me and they're saying, I need to pass this test in the next 30 days, 60 days, something like that, for example. But unfortunately, when I look at their study habits and maybe their previous score on the exam, I can see that they're a person where we need to start over. We really just need to go back and start from scratch. And that's really difficult to have to tell someone when they're, again, feeling like they're under the gun here and seeing the days counting down to when they might be out of work. And so that's really, really, really tough. And that's my least favorite part of this job is telling people that they need to study longer or more time, or that they might have to, or they might end up losing their job, for example, because I just don't think they're going to be ready in time. Very heartbreaking, and I don't like having to do that. Another thing that people in crisis sometimes struggle with, despite the fact they're in crisis, is asking people for help. Again, helpers tend to sometimes be hyper independent. And again, this could be because of life experience, trauma. Again, if you're the highest functioning person in your family, again, you're that beacon of hope. You're that person that handles all the problems and the crises. You're so used to doing everything on your own, don't know how to ask for help or let people support you. And so, again, that's another reason why sometimes people have ended up in this crisis situation, because they've been doing everything on their own, handling everything, not delegating things, not asking for support, and then therefore setting themselves up to not do well on the exam because they're just overextended. So because, that pressure, the stress, sometimes when people are in a state of crisis like this, sometimes they're at a place where they're like, you know what, just tell me what to do. I'll do whatever you say because I don't know what else to do. But other times, again, if you're telling someone, hey, I think you need to start all over and study from scratch, but they're completely burnt out and can't even stand to look at this stuff, it can be hard to hear that you have to start all over. I hope this is making sense, that like, and if anyone's listening to this and you're in this position, my heart goes out to you, because this is very hard to be in this kind of situation. Now, when I'm working with people who are in crisis, they are the hardest to be able to help pass the exam. But there is a way out of this, okay? So I'm going to share with you some of the things that I have found that have helped people who are in crisis, who I've successfully been able to help them through this really difficult time and still pass the exam, okay? So I'm going to share with you some of the things that those people did differently, that the ones who unfortunately still were not able to pass the test, I'm going to show you the differences. So the first one is, whenever possible, they seek extensions. So if your back is up against the wall, your temporary license is running out in your state, or permission to take the exam is running out, you just reapply, asking for extensions. And I have seen people do this, and it has done wonders for them. It's given them just that little bit of extra time so that they can prepare a little bit longer and not have so much oppressive pressure coming down on them. Now, in some cases, that wasn't always possible. Jobs couldn't give an extension, or licenses weren't able to be extended. And so they had to go with kind of difficult measures to change employment, even sometimes temporarily working outside of the field, and maybe looking for something that was lower stress, so that they could have the time to devote to studying and pass the exam and then go ahead and get their actual license. I have seen multiple people do this. It was not easy. It was not what they wanted to do, but in the end, it changed the game for them. Of course, seeking help and support. I've had coaching clients who, again, get to that place within themselves where they decide, you know what, I got to reach out. I have to help. I have to ask for help. And they start talking with family, with their support system, letting people help them. And this comes in many different ways. Sometimes it's financial. Sometimes it's just like, hey, can you help me babysit my kids so I have time to study and pass this thing? There have been times where I've been brought to tears seeing how a coaching client went from saying, nobody can help me, I'm all on my own, it's all on me, to really having a change in their mindset and really opening up and allowing people to help them, and then seeing their support system. I mean, everything from employers to family to friends to spouses, even their older children, for example, coming together and helping them, and seeing them come through this really difficult time of crisis and being able to push through. It has been magical to see that happen. So that's people in crisis who are in a really difficult situation. Again, they can still come through it. It's just going to take sometimes some drastic measures, and really letting go of the way we want to do things and really opening ourselves up to trying new things. Now, for those who are in the complicated sort of category, typically they are not in immediate danger of losing a job or a temporary license, which is good. It's a relief. But on the flip side, that actually can cause challenges, because if there's not enough motivation, remember the Yerkes-Dodson curve, right? Too much stress, performance goes down. Not enough stress, performance can go down. So when we don't have enough pressure on us to really push through, sometimes that can keep people a little bit stuck. And a lot of times when people are in that position, they've really lost a sense of hope. They've lost a sense of why they're doing this, what they're fighting for, what their dreams are, what they want to do once they're licensed. They often will report feeling like they're stuck in a rut. And again, just like the group in crisis, they may have underlying issues like anxiety, self-esteem, burnout, which also is keeping them stuck. Again, they may or may not be in personal therapy. Sometimes they are, sometimes they are. Sometimes I actually will recommend that people go to therapy. And I absolutely love when I see them take that recommendation they start doing their own personal therapy. And I literally can see in real time how their study habits are changing because they're dealing with those underlying issues in their personal therapy. It's really beautiful to watch that. Now, again, sometimes this group can also struggle to ask for help. And so that's part of what's keeping them stuck because they're not fully reaching out and utilizing all of their support. I've worked with people who sometimes no one even knows they're studying for the exam, not even their employer. So no one can help them. No one can provide any type of support because no one even knows they're studying. Now, again, sometimes when we are stuck in that rut and we're feeling kind of down, feeling kind of hopeless, it can again be difficult to fully dive into the coaching program and the system because again, we just feel disillusioned, we feel exhausted, we feel over it. So it can be a challenge. Now, the thing that concerns me the most about the people in this kind of category are that sometimes they may end up in the crisis situation. And I think that's how a lot of people in crisis actually start off. They have some, again, these underlying things, maybe don't fully have the support that they need. And time is kind of going by and they may or may not be studying. Sometimes people are taking the test over and over again. And sometimes people are very deep in avoidance. And so they're not studying or they're not trying to attempt the test. But either way, time is passing. So I have seen some situations where people have kind of come in and out of coaching. They're like, yeah, I'm ready to study. I'm ready to do this. Come for a couple sessions. They kind of get into the studying. And as soon as they get into it, again, all the fears that this thing is biased, I'm never going to pass, or I can't do this, whatever their negative self-talk is, begins to overwhelm them and they go right back into avoidance. And then sometimes a few months will pass, sometimes even years will pass. They'll kind of come back like, oh my God, I need to do this. And so again, if they're in a state where maybe they've got, or a job where maybe they've got a couple years to be able to become licensed, next thing you know, time is just passing. And then sometimes they'll come back or maybe come to me for the first time. And that's when we're in full-blown crisis. I'm going to lose my job in 30 days, or I have, 60 days, or else I'm going to fail. And again, that's a very difficult position to be in. I would say people in this group have a moderate level of success with passing the exam. And so now I'm going to share with you the ones who, again, come through this challenge. They come out of feeling like they're stuck in a rut and they go on to successfully pass the exam. I'm going to share with you what they're doing that I think is what ultimately helped them to move forward. And it's very similar to the crisis group. Again, they go ahead and they get in therapy. They figure out what underneath is holding them back. They seek help and support from family, loved ones. They clue their employer in, start getting support there, start getting stuff taken off their plate. Because again, a lot of times people in this group are overworking as well. They also get in touch with their why. They start reminding themselves why they wanted to get licensed to begin with, what their dreams and hopes are. I do a lot of exercises with my coaching clients and I encourage them to do something every time they study to help them remain connected with why they're doing this, to really keep that fire lit underneath of them. Furthermore, they're again involve their support system for added accountability. Oops, sorry. And they really just, one thing I didn't add on there is once they have these things in place, then they can fully dive into the study plan that I give them and really be able to make it work because now they're in a better headspace and they feel more supported. So I have worked with tons of people in this category who have been able to come through to the other side and pass the exam. And if you look on my website, I have some testimonials and you'll see people sharing their story and you'll hear as they're telling their story kind of where they were before they started coaching. Now, in conclusion, I'm going to end with the people who are coming in the most ideal situation who typically have the easiest time being able to pass using coaching support. And so I'm going to go through those things. So first of all, typically they're not in an immediate danger of losing a job. So, and again, it doesn't mean that they don't have a countdown. It's just that the amount of time that they have left is enough given where they are in their level of readiness. So I work with tons of people who've got maybe 3 months, 4 months until they're going to lose their job. Heck, I was even in that position. When I really got serious about studying, I had 5 months and I studied for 4. So I was kind of down to the wire too. However, I had enough time to get myself where I needed to get to. So these people typically have a good amount of external and internal motivation. So they're in that comfort or stretch area within the Yerkes-Dodson law that really helps them to operate at their best. Furthermore, it's not like people in this group don't have challenges. Let me be very clear. I have worked with, like I said before, tons of people with ADHD, learning disabilities, family challenges, like everything you can think of. But the difference of how they're able to overcome it, they're in therapy. And if they need medication, they are taking their medication. They are getting that anxiety under control. I've helped tons of people with clinically diagnosed anxiety disorders to pass this exam. But they're doing their part by working on their mental health. And it makes all the difference. Of course, open to the coaching system. Whenever I do feedback sessions with every single person I work with, whether they pass the exam or not afterward. So we can thoroughly analyze what happened. And when I'm working with people who successfully pass the exam and they're walking me through everything they did on exam day, and then we're also reflecting on everything they did during their study journey that was different than the way they studied before, we can literally see how like they did everything I encouraged them to do, and they can see how much it helped them. The other thing that people in this group do is they're open to asking for help and setting boundaries with others. And, again, just mobilizing their support system. Again, at work as well. And they have the highest success rate. So I'll say in conclusion that, so we can have some time for questions, that no matter how someone comes to me, whether they come in crisis or in a complicated situation, they can become in an ideal situation. And they can set themselves up to pass this exam and go on and have an amazing career. So again, I just want to say in conclusion that as people of color, I know wholeheartedly from sheer evidence, years now of experience, that we can pass this exam just as much as anyone else, as long as we have the right mindset and the right plan. So I'd like to turn it over to answering some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ligons. That was fantastic and super informative. I certainly have some questions, but would love for other folks to jump in.
I actually have a question. Is it true that if a person is struggling with anxiety, that they can receive extra time on the EPPP?
Yes, ma'am, they certainly can. And I strongly encourage that you do that again. So when I look at like, how did people go from struggling to passing? So often they added the accommodations in conjunction with my study plan. In fact, I've had coaching clients where I've begged them to get accommodations. And again, sometimes if they're dealing with some internalized ableism or stigma, that can keep them from getting the support they need. But I encourage people, please seek accommodations. If you even think you could possibly benefit from them, please talk to your state board, find out what qualifies and what evidence you need to support, and get the accommodations. And if you get them, please use them. Sometimes people will get the accommodations, But again, because of that internalized stigma, they still will put pressure on themselves to finish the exam within the normal amount of time. Please don't do that. Give yourself the time. Thank you for that question.
Maybe it'd be helpful. So I know that extra time is an accommodation. Other accommodations, at least that I'm aware of, is testing in your own room. Any other accommodations that folks may want to be aware of? Those are the two that are coming to mind for me.
Those are the main two. Now, I have heard of some people who have certain health conditions where they are allowed to have like water or something in the room, or maybe usually they don't let you bring any of that kind of stuff in. But like if you have certain health problems where maybe you need to eat or you need to stay hydrated, they might let you have something in the room. Also, you can wear noise canceling headphones during the exam if you're in the bigger room, to help drown out sound if you have any troubles with, distractibility or just overstimulation from sounds.
Yeah, and they give those to you, so you don't have to supply them. Great question. What other things are coming up for folks?
Please don't be shy.
Okay, I'll jump in with my question. So like I said, I think this was fantastically informative. One of the things that I was sort of wrestling with and wondering how you advise is, folks where they aren't studying enough or studying inconsistently, but are also working like, just have no time, can't necessarily scale back at work, have family responsibility. Like it just doesn't seem like anything can give. I'm curious, any recommendations or suggestions, like what do you do when you're sort of between a rock and a hard place?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And it's interesting. After some years now, I have yet to see a person where we can't scale back. But there's a difference between whether they can scale back and whether they think they can scale back. And that is often the challenge, is that we've been operating in a way for so long where overextension just becomes what we do. Like I'll ask people sometimes like, well, how many clients are you supposed to see or each week? And sometimes they don't even know. They're just working and working, filling every slot, overdoing, and they don't even know. So I always encourage people, have a conversation with their supervisor, clarify what's expected. I just have yet to see a person that can't scale back, but I have met a ton of people who don't want to or who don't think it's possible. And so a lot of the work I do with people sometimes is some exploratory conversations to explore what is making you think that you can't scale back. And sometimes there's some things under there, sense of value, sense of worth is tied up in some things, or it's just habit. So it takes some drastic stuff, but you'd be surprised too how often I'm talking to people and I'll tell them, hey, again, I never thought I would spend so much time trying to convince people either not to test or even not to study, where I'll put people on pause. I'll say, hey, listen, your life's out of control. I need you to take the next 2 to 3 months to discharge cases that don't need to be seen, cut back on your caseload, delegate, get your partner involved, ask family for help, whatever you got to do, and then see me in 3 months. And so many times they'll kind of be a little disgruntled sometimes because they may not want to hear that. And they'll go home and they'll be like, can you believe this coach I saw? I imagine this is kind of how it sounds. I wasn't there for the conversation, but I imagine this is how it sounds. Can you believe this coach is telling me I need to take 3 months? And then the friends and family are like, thank goodness. We've been telling you for years that you need to scale back. And sometimes they'll come back and they'll be like, talk to my family and friends, and they said, you're right, I'm doing too much. And they really appreciate you being willing to tell me that. But then other times I'll say that to people And deep down inside, they needed to hear it. They wanted to hear it. And they're so grateful and so like, thank you for giving me permission to just take a break or to scale back. So it all depends on the person. And I don't know if that answered the question.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I saw there's a couple other questions that came in the chat. So first one, are there any recommended websites or books to help study or test yourself?
Yeah, so the test prep companies, some of the top ones are like PrepJet, ATABS, also known as AATBS, Psych Prep. Those are the top three most common that I use. I have my personal favorites, and I go over that with my coaching clients and really help them to figure out which one is best for them. But those top three is where I would investigate the most, or the ones that people use the most.
Great. Thank you. And the next question, is it ever too late to take the exam after a couple of attempts? It's been a long time, it's complicated, but I'm in a better position now, no time constraints.
It's never too late. As long as you have air in your lungs and your heart is still beating, there is time. Let me tell you something. I have a beautiful testimonial story of someone I worked with. It's been at least a year or two now. She passed on her 16th attempt. This is a single mom of color. She is an inspiration to us all. Please go on my testimonial page. My website is crushtheEPPP.com. Maybe I can put that in the chat. I'll type that in there really quick. Her name is Dr. Naima. She is just an inspiration. And she just never gave up. She never gave up. And she is living her best life now.
That's amazing. So awesome to hear. All right. Any other last minute questions before we wrap up for the evening?
Yeah, Tab looks like
Tab?
she has.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for sharing that about Dr. Naima, because I'm in a double digit single parent children, all of that. And I'm like, okay, it took Kennedy 7 times to pass the bar. I don't have anything else to weigh. So the fact that you said that gives me hope. And there's multiple things, which is interesting. Multiple things will happen like 2 weeks before. Scary to me sometimes. Like it's 2 weeks before the exam, something drastic will happen in the family, a death, illness, a hospitalization. And I was like, it's been every single time. Or with my sleep disorder, I fall asleep. And so I'm like, I have to find a balance. And thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for this space. And I'm not giving up until it's done. I've spent a considerable amount of money, but it's no longer, I'm not thinking, for some reason, it's no longer about the money. It's about passing this exam. It has to be bigger than the money now.
And let me tell you, you most certainly can do this. And Dr. Naima, bless her heart, we stripped it down and rebuilt it from the ground up. Totally changed everything about her study approach. And again, some of those external life things too, gave some suggestions. I mean, she did it all. She really took the advice, changed everything, and it paid off.
What a wonderful note to end on. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Again, special thank you to Dr. Ligons for spending the last hour with us. And yeah, hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your evening.
Good luck, everyone. You can do it.
Take care. Bye-bye.